Hello, I'm Tim Martin from the Falmouth Genealogical Society. If I'm not mistaken, it's the 11th of February, 2023, and we meet every second Saturday of every month generally. Once in a while, we have to find another slot, but we're here on our regular pattern. And one little thing different here of those people on Zoom, there is a little option for you to view who's in the room if you want to feel a little more present. That's there to click on if you want. But we have a local speaker now. I always love having a Falmouth person because we are the Falmouth Genealogical Society. And so Mary Berry told me about Tamsen George. And I think, what she has to bring here, I think is really welcome to us. I'm loving to hear from her. So, what did she just say? Oh, okay, thanks. Okay. So, let me read to you. This is what Dottie put together. She says, Tamsen has a BA from Connecticut College and studied nonprofit administration at Radcliffe. She had a 32-year career in nonprofit arts administration. She held a position at the Shirley Eustis, I guess that's two surnames, no doubt, Shirley Eustis House in Roxbury, which included moving a carriage house from Brookline to the site. She first came to the Cape. We always have to know that, don't we? She first came to the Cape when she was about 6 years old and has been in Falmouth for 18 years. She served on the Falmouth Historical Commission and the Falmouth Community Preservation Committee. Apparently, she currently is. You can say whatever you want about yourself in a moment. She was president of the Falmouth Historical Society twice. And so I guess those are 4-year terms or something. And so that's, I think, but at any rate, we're really glad to have you. And so her title that she's taken is from her book, Allegiance, the Life and Times of William Eustis. That's the title. Thank you, Tamsen. So come up and say hi. And when you're ready for PowerPoint, just tell me.
Well, hi. And I have been here since about 6 years old, but then I moved here about 20 years ago. I lived in Sandwich before that, but Falmouth's got more here. Sandwich may have more daffodils, but we have more action. We have more stuff here. So I have been here for sort of a longish time in residence. I don't know that I have much to say further about myself other than what I will say in my talk, because I want to get into how I ended up with this project. So if you want to just connect the thing, I can do that.
We're sharing the screen. We are minimizing stuff that we don't want on the screen. Come on. Hide the floating controls. Now we're going to start the presentation. Well, there we go. Is that slide 1?
Yep.
Good. Okay.
Yep. So that's when Tim said he wanted to have more about research and what I did to research this book. So I changed my title and added the word research in there because I thought it sounded better. It was more appropriate to the whole thing about what you're working on. And as I said, I did nonprofit administration, which means you live on this knife edge of whether you're going to bring in enough money to survive the year or not, which makes it kind of interesting. It doesn't mean, so you're entertained through the whole work career business. However, you don't make any money at it. But anyway, it's interesting. So I ended up in historic sites and in museums. So anyway, thanks for the invitation. I think it makes it kind of fun to speak here, and I don't have to drive that far. So that makes it kind of nice. Let me see if this works the right way. There's the guy. All right, so I wrote the book about him, his whole biography. And I found out that research, as you all know, is really about solving puzzles. And if you like doing puzzles, then you're good. So it took me almost, well, 8 years anyway, to do this. And because I did it while I was doing other things. We all have a life as well. And so the reason I got into this guy, well, I'll tell you about that. Let me go to this next one. This is Shirley Place. It's the Shirley Eustis House Association. So this is the last sites that I ran. And it's on the sort of the Dorchester-Roxbury line on a hill that looks down on what used to be Back Bay. Back Bay used to be water. So you lived in Boston, you had your townhouse in Boston, but you built a country house out in Roxbury. Initially, that was the site where you did the country houses. And then you could take a boat across Back Bay over to the town of Boston. I'll show you. I think I have a map of that for you later. Anyway, I worked here and I moved a carriage house and we did some landscaping, and I could have used Mary at that time. And we were interested because it's named Shirley for Governor William Shirley, who was the royal governor, one of the last good royal governors we had, and he built it. And then the last governor that lived there was Governor William Eustis. And so that's how you get the Shirley-Eustis name. It's not a woman. People would say to me, who is she? You know. And so the royal governor did this design, and they're finally have figured out who the architect was, and there's all that kind of interesting stuff on it. But we didn't know very much about William Eustis, other than that when he died, he was the governor of Massachusetts in office in 1825. And so there seemed to be a lot of question about him. And I figured that the thing to do was to get, and the board thought we should get a biography written of some kind about him. So I raised the money, got a couple of grants, but then I retired and my successor did not carry it on. So they had this money sitting there. So actually I talked to them about it a couple of years ago and they said, oh, we don't know anything about that. So anyway, when I retired, I got reading history. We like that. And I started reading the contrary ones. I read what the British wrote about the Revolutionary War. And I read about the life of Aaron Burr and Benedict Arnold, and those ones that are, you know, kind of questionable. So the weird thing was that those biographies of Burr and Arnold mentioned William Eustis. So I thought that's very strange. And so this is really kind of like, for me, it was a question of, I needed to clear my karma because I had raised money based on the fact that I was going to have this book done and I was going to hire somebody to do it, you know. And so I thought the name keeps coming up. So you got to do something, you know, it's a committal in a way. And so, and you may have run into this situation, you know, that something happens and calls your attention to it and you ignore it for a little bit. And then it comes up again and the name floats up again. Maybe some relative's name keeps coming up and, you know, you better pay attention to it. So I began, and I found out you never know what is involved in writing nonfiction. I didn't know, I had never done it. And I found the first thing was that one problem is that everything has to be true and you have to document it. You can't just, you know, go off and make it up. So then I had to really figure out a lot of huge questions to understand this guy who lived 250 years ago or so. First of all, things like where was he born? You know, it was just like your basic stuff. We knew when he died. It said he was born in Boston, but some research done proved that actually he was born in Cambridge. So little things like that. Do I need to let you do something?
No, that just appeared randomly. That was annoying. Right.
So anyway, so what I found out is that if you can get letters or documents done at the period of time, you can find out more information. If you can get diaries, if you can get something that locally they have written, it makes a big difference. And sorry, I can just hand it over to you. No. So I wanted to figure out what motivated this guy. And so I needed to look for letters because that's the only way you find out. Now, the problem with letters are they have to be saved. And if you're a famous person, like John Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they knew they were doing something important. So they saw to it that their letters were saved. They would make copies before they were sent, and they saved everything that came in. The only tricky part was Martha Washington, after George died, decided nothing personal should exist and go on, so she burned the personal stuff. But generally, they saved all that they had. John Adams saved everything because he knew he was going to be famous one day. It's interesting how they looked at stuff. After his death, Hamilton's wife spent her time building him up into a heroic figure. She lived many years after him, and she sort of covered up his little romantic flings and things like that that you find out if you go digging. So he's not how he's portrayed in the play. But it didn't get me to Eustis. I could find out these other things. And so what I needed to do is find out what Boston was like in the 18th century and what this period of time was like, because it was really literally a different country where they did things differently in the 18th century than what we're living in the 21st century. So different expectations, even how they decorated their houses was different. It was very practical. They kept their furniture against the walls. And then when you had people for tea, you moved them out. And that was because if you kept the furniture against the walls, you could sweep the rug in the middle. You know, it made sense, particularly if you're the lady of the house and you have to do all this, you know. So let me see. So the other thing I found out was that the founding, now didn't I move that? We're not moving.
Right, let's see if we have to click on the screen or something. Does it move now? Yeah, okay.
Except that's not the picture I wanted.
Okay.
No, maybe it's the one we have to do next. That's about research. It's not the founding fathers that really built the country. It was the regular people. It's the people that were the common people. Our relatives, mostly immigrants, like we all, actually everybody in the country is. The founding fathers were the elite bunch that had the plans and the theories, and they worked out up here. But the common people were the ones that got dirty and fought the war, for the Revolutionary War. So they had this primary idea that they should have the same rights as Englishmen. Now, the Englishmen looked at us as sort of peasants over here. We're really not on their level. So they were thinking that we were Yankee Doodles. We were not up on their level at all. So that they didn't think there was any reason to give us the same glamorous life. Well, rights anyway. But, and this is when I was talking about my research. So let me go see if I can get you a picture of the next one I was going to. Oh yeah, these are the regular people that fought the war. Just the guys behind the dirt thrown up. That's Beacon Hill, not Bunker Hill. It's Bunker Hill. And Sam Adams. Okay, now Sam Adams was hugely influential in William Eustis's life. It was how he became really involved in politics, because Sam was involved in setting up the town of Boston just after the Revolutionary War. And he started the first Boston School Committee, one of the things he did. And he enrolled William Eustis in being a representative of the Boston School Committee to make up their educational system. So that is how, in the long run, a doctor, Eustis started out in getting into politics. Now, in doing the research, as you'll find, you have to read 18th century script. That always upsets me because I know children today don't learn to read script at all, much less 18th century script. So I had to go looking to find whether I could get anything written down, diaries written in the 18th century script, they were lovely, that letters you had correspondence, and Eustis had no direct heirs at all. His wife didn't save anything. She followed Martha Washington's example. So I've managed to find 2 or 3 letters of hers that were sent to other people that they happened to keep. And so you have to go and look in a lot of different places. And Eustis himself, his letters are saved in government records, like the Library of Congress and the Mass Historical Society. That's a great source. His wife, as I said, destroyed everything. But then if you can find friends that they corresponded with, you can maybe get something there. And so I was looking up, and as I said earlier, he was a friend of Aaron Burr's. So then Aaron Burr's stuff has been saved, a lot of it. And I could find letters between them that way. So, so it took me 8 years, as I said. And I had excuses to go to a lot of places, talk to a lot of people, poke into things. I went to conferences, one at West Point. And at West Point, it was very useful because there were military people there. And I wanted to find out about the frigate Congress, one of the first 6 that were built by Washington. Where did it, when it went to Europe, what port did it go into? I knew they left Boston, but I knew that ultimately they got to Brussels, but I didn't know on the way how they did it. So I wanted the log so I could find the ship's log. And you do find surprising things when you do this. I founded the Mass Historical Society. They had a letter from Eustis when he was a medical apprentice to Dr. Joseph Warren. And he wrote to his friend, Jack, that about an expedition made by medical apprentices of Warren to try to get a hold of the body of a thief from the gallows in Boston, because then they could practice dissection as medical students. It was highly illegal. The church was very upset with this practice. They thought God would be mad because you had to reassemble the body and like that. But it's a rare letter because it talks about how 3 of these medical apprentices went down to the gallows, which was on Boston Neck. So you came through the gates of Boston, and kind of the next thing you saw was the gallows. So it kind of said, behave yourselves. You're coming into our town. And so, it's a fantastic thing to find this letter. And people have used it as reference later when they're talking about medical studies. Now, as I was going along on this whole thing, I found, pretty much to my amazement, that Eustis was like the Forrest Gump of the Revolutionary War. He knew everybody once I got into it, and looking for his friends. So as Gump appears in the photographs of everybody, Eustis was in his friends' letters, and that's how I found him there. Now, this is the Library of Congress. So because he was in politics, he left being a doctor and moved into politics. There was some very interesting letters about his disillusionment with medicine because he really could not help the people he wanted to. There wasn't enough medical knowledge. And at that time, there wasn't. They were still basing it on the Greeks. And there just wasn't enough to do what you wanted to do. So he started getting into politics because he found he could do more for locals in politics. So he started out at the House of Representatives in Boston. He ran for the House and was elected to that for about 10 years. But I went to the Library of Congress, and I know that you can only read microfiche in 18th century script for 3 hours at a time because your eyes will fall out. And you have to leave. You have to leave and go out and walk on the mall for a good long time. And the way I got to some of this information was to go over these nonfiction books always have authors documented in the back. So you look at your footnotes and you go and you look at the footnotes and the reference in the footnotes. And that will tell you where this letter was found. I found a letter of Aaron Burr to William Eustis at Louisiana State University files because it was referenced in another book. Otherwise, and if I hadn't read there, I read the footnotes. Absolutely, So, and another lead I found in a footnote, I took the train, went down to the New York Historical Society. I had a friend, we decided we'd go to New York for the week. However, I spent all of my 5 days there at the New York Historical Society. And what was terrifically startling to me, which I hadn't realized, was that you talk to the librarians and they're interested actually in helping you. And they will give you, suggestions. And I found a lead there that amazed me because the librarian said, I think we have a folder of letters. And it isn't in there, wasn't in their index. And it wasn't in, there was not microfiche, hadn't been done yet. And so she said, let me get it out. And it was a folder of 27 original letters. And I was absolutely stunned. So I, of course, spent my days going back and copying them out so that I could reference them when I got back. Coming home, I really was astounded because it seemed to me in reading the letters, it appeared that William Eustis was gay. And I thought, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that at all. And then I thought, but it's maybe our 21st century way of looking at things. And maybe it's not the way they looked at things in the 18th century. Maybe they did write affectionately in the 18th century that way. I know some women did. I didn't know if the men did. So I thought, well, I'm now going to have to, see, would you get this? I'm now going to have to go and research homosexuality in the Revolutionary War, And surprisingly enough, I found him mentioned. So with another couple of young officers that had formed a little group with Baron von Steuben. So I thought, oh, well, this is interesting. So then what about his wife, So the thing about correspondence is that it's one-sided. Yeah, I'm writing to you, I ask a question, but I don't necessarily get the answer back. And it's hard to follow because you don't get both sides of the conversation. So in the beginning part of the war, Eustis wrote to Jack Warren, who was another doctor. How did the expedition go? I hope no bloody noses. And I thought, well, what expedition? What were they doing? I don't understand that. So I knew the date of the letter. So I had to go through history records and what was going on in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, because I knew Jack Warren was up in Boston. What was going on that date or a little bit before that? And I found out that's when they were trying to get the British out of Newport, and that Jack Warren had gone along as a doctor on that expedition because he went through medical training with William Eustis. So, you get the reference, but then it just leaves you with questions. So we have more questions. Let me see what I've got for a picture for you. There's Warren. Now, he's an amazing guy because there's a whole lot about him. I have a friend that wrote a book about him. There's several biographies out about him now. He died on Bunker Hill. Otherwise, he would have possibly been our first president. He was absolutely a leader in the Revolutionary War. He and Sam Adams and John Hancock were the ones in Boston. And during the ride of Paul Revere, he's the one that sent Paul Revere out. I'll tell you that in a minute or so. But he wanted to go along, and he died, sword in his hand, got shot. But now Warren was a doctor. His house was in Boston, right near the Green Dragon Tavern, where he would meet with Sam Adams. And the Sons of Liberty. So Eustis was his apprentice. Because when you were educated to be a doctor, you had to be a college graduate, or you had to be very literate. You had to be able to read. And then you found a doctor and you said, I want to be your apprentice. And if the doctor accepted you, then you moved into his house for 2 years. Your apprenticeship was 2 years. And then you could hang out your shingle and you'd be a doctor. So he then goes and moves into Warren's house, Hancock Street toward the north end. It's actually now buried under City Hall. And so he worked as an assistant. He went along with him on house calls. And one of the most frequent things that they did and what they learned to do was bloodletting. The concept of disease was dis-ease. You were off balance. And to get you back in balance, if you drew some blood, you would then recover and get back into balance. Now, this is from the Greeks. And this is the same thing the Greeks were doing, hundreds of years before. And we haven't improved on it since. So that's why Eustis was getting so disturbed with, he would do his bleeding, he believed in bleeding, but the people didn't often get better. So now in another story that I found in the Dedham Historical Society, William Dawes, who was the other man who rode out with Paul Revere, had been making a little raid with a couple of other guys on Boston Common, and they stole 2 cannons of the British, small ones. They were probably 6-pounders. And so the guys were carrying them off in the night to hide them. And then they figured that what they would do, eventually this is what they did, is they get them out to Concord. But you got to steal it first. And so Dawes is carrying along, helping carry the cannon, and he had a button that got mashed into his wrist so badly that he couldn't extract it himself. So he had to go to Dr. Warren to have Warren get the button out. So, so Eustis then lives with Warren. Through the involvement of Warren with all the planning of the beginning parts of the war, when we had a Continental Congress meeting, first time and then the second time in Philadelphia. And so Sam Adams would go to that, Hancock would go. And in that time, when they were away and out of town, it was Warren who was in charge. So William Eustis grew up with the beginning parts of the Revolutionary War. I didn't realize this. But when you realize if he lived in Warren's house, and excuse me, Warren was the planner, he would be there. And also in a medical office, a surgery, all the news and the gossip comes through it because you have people coming in and out all the time. And so if you look in the logs of the surgery, you see interesting people have come in. One noted as, fishermen. That's all. And I'm thinking there was another one called Camp Woman. I don't know whether that means that are they spies? We don't know who they were, but they didn't get names. Some of them didn't. Okay, now this is what I wanted to get to, is the layout of Boston. You can see down at the bottom, the neck to come into Boston, it's like a pollywog, or a weird animal anyway. But you see the bottom, the tail at the bottom is Boston Neck. And that's where General Gage put up a lot of greater defense. The town gates were there, but he put up a lot more around it to defend, because actually if you shut that off, people don't get into Boston except by water. And you had the British Navy surrounding it. So that's how Boston became so nicely isolated. And so I did have a pointer, but I won't. Just, you remember the shape. The mill pond is that thing up at the top, and Eustis' house is right near the mill pond. The U-shaped at the top. A mill pond I thought was very interesting. I had to find out about them because it's tidal action. So you put the mills up on the breakwater there. Tide comes in, turns, goes out, turns. So now I want to get to the sort of more famous 19th of April. Longfellow's poem, Listen, My Children, and You Shall Hear, famous ride of, or midnight ride of Paul Revere. Dawes did not rhyme as well as Revere. So I tried to think about it, rewrite it, and you'd say, listen, my children, and give a pause to hear the story of William Dawes, who rode out at midnight, you know, it would be a job to rewrite it. But anyway, that's why Revere is in there. And he's become more famous than William Dawes. So we had them, Dr. Warren and Dr. Eustis, in the surgery on Beacon Hill. I can't show you where it is, but the hills are there. And they were there by Beacon Hill in their office. And they would get the news coming through the office. So they got the news that there was a lot of activity on the common. The British were camped on the common. The British soldiers were all camped on the common in their, tents. And they said, there's a lot going on. So William Eustis and Dr. Warren take a walk out in the evening. We take an evening stroll and we just go take a look. And clearly something's going on because you see the guys getting their rifles out and they're packing the packs and they're getting the gear ready to go traveling. And so they think, this is kind of serious. So they have some young boys that are very good at listening and hanging out. And they have some prostitutes that are in the inside and they can ask them to find out about things. And they have some spies that wander around in the taverns and so on. So they really realized that General Gage is going to come out that night. And so it was just something was up, and Hancock and Sam Adams were out in Lexington because they were meeting out there. So that meant Warren's in charge in town. So they're getting concerned. So they figure they better do something about it. And then they get a spy brings them in a note that was intercepted in General Gage's office. And it says, get out there, get out in the country. It's a note that came over from London that says, you got to do something. We're tired of sitting around you waiting there. You're just in Boston, closed up in the town of Boston. So they figured, okay, he's going to go out. And they watched further, and the battleship Asia, British battleship Asia, 64 guns, was between Boston and Charlestown. And they were rounding up the ferry. Ferry wasn't going to work anymore to Charlestown. Pull the ferry over. And a lot of the different small whaleboats that serviced the British Navy were brought in to the common down on the shore, where it ran into the Charles River and Back Bay, which is much bigger because Back Bay got filled. So it looked like clearly something was happening. Now this is William Dawes. There's a little contrast between his picture and Paul Revere's, which I'll show you. But so Dr. Warren calls William Dawes into his office, and William Eustis is hanging around. And so based on the information from local spies that had gained access to General Gage's correspondence, Warren asked Dawes to try to reach Adams and Hancock in Lexington because he knew they were out there. And he knew that Gage was probably going to go out to Lexington to try to get him. And he knew also that they knew that the British knew, the British knew that powder and guns were being stored in Concord. So he said, can you get out? And Dawes says, yeah, I can get out the town. So he gets his horse and he leaves by the town gates before they get closed at night. So it's about 9 o'clock. So he wasn't suspicious. However, the other guy, Paul Revere, was a suspicious character around town. The British knew he was kind of a rabble-rouser. So Warren decided he'd be the backup rider to Dawes if he could do it. But he had to get out of town, but not through the gates where the British were. So Revere has planned on this possibility. And he's talked to the people in Charlestown about what he'll do. He'll signal them. And if he signals them, they will know what to do. It's going to be in the church, the North Church Tower. He'll put signal lights. And so the people in Charlestown will see the lights. and then they will start alarming the countryside that the British will be coming out. And their system was firing muskets in relay or building bonfires. So they had this figured out. The possibility that Revere might not get there was strong because he was a suspicious guy. But he did. He had a couple of friends row him over in the dark at night, right by the big battleship Asia. And he gets over to Charlestown. And the people in Charlestown have got the minister's best horse waiting for him. And her name is Brown Bess. So the gets on the horse. He starts out riding for Lexington, and he's also going to try to warn Sam Adams and John Hancock. So he sets off, Dawes sets off, and that's sort of the end of the story that we know. But the preparations that Revere made are kind of interesting because they were ready. I think they must have talked about this quite a bit. So the next day comes at dawn, the 19th of April, as in the poem, and Eustis is waked up by Dr. Warren. And Warren is going to leave because he's got a meeting over the river in Menotomy, which is what they called Arlington. He wants to meet with General William Heath, which is the only kind of military guy they got helping them out in the Sons of Liberty, in the control section on what's going on in the military means, if that makes any sense. They oversaw the military matters in the colony. So he wakes up Eustis. He says, I'm going to leave. The ferry's running again, and I'm going to get out town. And you keep the surgery open. You stay here and mind the store. I'm going to head out. And I might find out what's going on over there by doing this, because they had no information. And this is another thing that I had to adjust to, was that there was no communication traveling. There was no radio. There was no Morse code. There was nothing that moved faster than somebody on a horse. And if somebody on a horse hadn't gotten free of wherever something was going on, maybe if it was, no, but not the news hadn't come back. But Lexington had them worried because William Eustis's family had moved to Lexington. And they knew again that Sam Adams and John Hancock were there. So Eustis knew that his family had moved there because they evacuated Boston. Boston was too difficult to live in. And if you could, you would move out of town while it was being occupied by the British. So they moved out of town. So this is Lexington Green. So the next morning, Eustis opens the surgery as instructed by Dr. Warren, who was off for the ferry to leave to go across to meet with General Heath. And so the doctor's waiting room gets to be kind of a place where people check into to see, do you know what's going on? Have you heard anything? They knew that Warren was in charge of the colony, and here's Warren, he's left, he's gone over the river. So there was no news. But about lunchtime, shortly after noon, a man named Moses Gill came into the surgery with his one horse buggy. He stopped in the bunch outside in the street. He got on, came in the surgery. And he was involved with the Sons of Liberty, but in a different committee. But he wanted to know what was going on because he knew something was happening out in the country. So he told Eustis he was going to go over to Cambridge and take a look, and maybe he'd go to Menotomy or Arlington. Just take a look around, see if he could get some news. And did Eustis want to come along? Now, mind you, here's Eustis. He's a doctor. He's just 22. But it would mean closing the office. And he'd been told by Warren to keep it open. So this is the question I have for you. These are the two roads diverged in the woods. But which one? And as a point of decision, and Frost's roads, of course, the question is, what did Eustis do? He's been told to stay and keep the surgery open. He's got a guy come by and says, look, I've got my buggy outside the door. Let's go find out what's going on. So the question is, did he stay loyal to his instructions? or, and be available to keep the surgery open for patients and wait for Warren to return? Or did he go and ride off and find out what's going on? So the question is, do I go or do I stay? And if you're a young man of 22, what do you think he did?
Go.
Yeah, he went. And another thing behind it was that he knew his mother was in Lexington and she was seriously ill. And so he knew the British were going to Lexington, but, Mom was there too. But then the conflict is he was devoted to Dr. Warren and the beliefs in the rebellion. So, and I realized that underlying my book is this whole question of loyalty and decisions and what you decide to do when you come to crossroads in your life. So you have to get into what is loyalty, what's treason. Now, treason was an interesting one to think about. The good people of the Revolutionary War were devoted to the idea of liberty and freedom from the mother country, England. And they were kind of like teenagers in rebellion against their parents. But technically, when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, they became traitors against the mother country. So then we have Benedict Arnold. Eustis knew him also. He lived with him in the same house down in New York. Now, it's interesting to me to think about Arnold because some people are committed to the idea that benefits the whole, and some people are committed to the idea of their own advancement and personal wealth. And that was Arnold. He was an achiever, but at the cost of others. And Washington thought he was the best fighter we had, and he was. He made a difference in winning the Battle of Saratoga. And that victory made the French allies. So it made all the difference in our future. And when he switched sides and changed his mind to fight for the British, he became a traitor, or did he? It's a question. Because we could say that he realized his error in leaving the mother country and repented his ways and became a loyal British citizen again. So, you can see get two sides to everything here. In the end, he never got the recognition he sought. The British were not going to trust a traitor no matter what. And if somebody just even came over to their side and helped them win the war, doesn't mean they're ever going to trust him again. So I have a chapter in my book about how Eustis was there with Washington when he discovered that Arnold had betrayed them all at West Point. So, and this is about really playing hide and seek in a game that you learned when you were a kid, because you got to poke around and you got to look under stones, and you might be able to find those decisive points in a relative story where they did this, did they go or did they stay? Would they do one thing or the other? Do you leave Europe and come to a new country like going to the moon? You don't know whether you're going to survive or not. How do these people, these relatives of ours that decided to come to this country, you think into how they made that decision and how transformative it is to figure if you can move to a country and then how do you support yourself? And you don't know for sure that you're going to be able to become a tavern keeper or a miller or fisherman or farmers, and what are they going to do with their lives when they get here? Whalers, why did they go to sea other than to catch whales? But then once you read about the first time they go, you think, why did you ever go back again? This business about how people decided what they were going to do, I found very interesting. So in the end, I got to the end of my book, wrapped him up, and he's buried in Lexington. Next to his mother. He carried a note in his pocket all through the Revolutionary War. I found this in somebody else's, letter that said, if I'm found dead, I want to be buried back home with my mother in Lexington. And she died about 6 weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill. She was that sick, and I don't really know what killed her. I haven't found anything that references other than, she died. She'd had something like 12 kids. But that's another whole discussion of women's lives. And his wife, William Eustis, did marry. He was 56, she was 30. Big age difference. He was treating her father, who was very sick. And when the father died, within a year or two, he married the daughter. And I don't know about her either, about why she decided to marry this old guy, but they had a good life. They did traveling in Europe. And no children, but they did a lot of adventure, and she lived 40 years after he died. So lived on in the Shirley Eustis house for another 40 years. He bought the Shirley Eustis house kind of when he came north after he retired government in Washington. So we can visit him today in Lexington. I had to track it down. Nobody knew where he was buried, but it makes it kind of interesting. And thank you for listening to my rambles. I never know what you might want to hear, and so we can go over any questions or anything you might want. But I just wanted to
Let me switch over
leave you with that,
so people
and
can,
I can do this. Yeah.
you,
So we
are
can.
you okay with finishing the slides now?
Yep.
Is that okay?
And get the slides off.
There we go. Okay. Can I ask an odd question to begin
Sure,
with,
odd
just to
ones are good.
excuse myself?
No.
Like I just realized I don't know what was typical for bloodletting. Do you know how
yeah.
that was done?
Oh, absolutely.
How was that done?
Well, you had a special little instrument called a fleam, which is a little sharp knife, or you could do it with a scalpel, fine scalpel. And what you did was you opened a vein. Basically, you opened a vein, and you could clench your hand the way they do when you take your blood today. When we have a blood drawn today.
So was that picture somewhat accurate? You think?
Oh yeah.
A vein in
You open the
certainly is a
vein.
vein here. Yeah.
Bleeds. You catch it in a porringer, and the inside of the porringer was marked, so you knew how much you were taking off. But the problem was, they thought that the human body had more blood in it than we do. That made it a little awkward, and that leads me to the story of how George Washington died, because he got very sick. Really, it was a version of what we would call strep throat, but he was seriously sick. And so Martha calls in the doctor. Doctor bleeds him. That's what you did. And he didn't get any better. So they call in the second doctor. He thought he should bleed him again, too. So he did. And they called in the third doctor, who also bled him. And that was in a question of something like 2 days. And he just bled to death. He was bled to death by his doctors. And finally, he said, no more, no more. Leave me alone. And he died. It's if you go to Mount Vernon, they'll tell you this story, and it just, that's why William Eustis got so disillusioned with medicine. He had a sister who died on her 12th child. It had been born dead, but she got this childbirth fever that got the women. And the thing that's horrifying is, you see in these letters, the women knew they could die having babies because so many of them did. And they knew it was a possibility. And this childbirth fever, what people didn't know was that it was so contagious, and that a doctor who didn't know to wash his hands could carry it right along to the next person. So, but they didn't know. It took them about another 100 years till about 1850 or so, 1860s, to find out that childbirth fever was transmitted by people. So the midwife, so this is what's, if you get into this, it's pretty appalling. So be grateful you survived.
I have a question, another one,
Yeah.
but someone else too. Any other questions? Wenda.
Not a question.
Okay.
Having been to Mount Vernon, George was not a rich man. He married money.
Oh, he married money.
His
Yeah.
wife, and
Yeah, Martha.
who they didn't have children.
Well, she had two
She had two
adopted sort of grandchildren that they took care of.
Um,
And he didn't, he was supposed to have gotten smallpox or something in the Caribbean in Barbados.
but
And
the
they think
house-
that made him sterile.
the house they bought only had a family dining room.
Yeah.
They added on a large wing, which went from front to back on the end of the house. And yes, that room was lined with chairs. And so if there was company who came in, they brought in boards and sawhorses, covered it with linen and pulled the chairs up.
There you go.
After dinner, the servants came in, took it away, and it became the dance.
Yeah, you could then socialize.
Unlike
Yeah.
Jefferson's house, which had a much larger dining table.
Well, he was an architect, I think, and in mind, he'd like to do that kind of thing. And so I think he would have thought it through differently.
That's why it's clocked. It's really
Yeah.
dark.
So you visited there and you've seen the color of that room.
Oh,
It's Kelly green. I mean, really.
Do any men know what Kelly green means?
Oh, well, Irish
What's
St. Patrick's Day green.
Is that what it is? Okay. All right.
You go in the room and you say, whoa. So it was interesting because they did like bright colors. And I realized it was because they lit everything by candles.
Well,
And
it's
so-
also a sign of financial. Because anything
Yeah.
of much of a color costs.
Oh, sure, a little more than whitewash. Yeah, it's just, I think it's fascinating. So anything else you want to talk about? Yeah.
Yeah, which in your research, was Dr. Eustis ever involved in the war?
He was a doctor. So for instance, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, he had a triage set up in this tavern that was at the base of the hill. And so people would be hauled down from wounded people hauled down from up on the hill. And he did that in other places as well. That he would be on the backup. So, and of course, the horrible part is his mentor, Warren, saying, I'm going up the hill. And he doesn't come down. And they don't know really whether he's wounded or the British have him as a prisoner or what happened. And it took a bit to find the body. Yeah.
For the Zoom people, the question was Eustis ever known to be directly involved in the war? That was the question. So
Oh.
I'll repeat the question just for
Oh,
the Zoom
sure.
people here. Go ahead.
Did you
Ray.
know that Joseph Warren belonged to the Masonic Lodge?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And so Eustis got into the Masons as well because of
Yeah,
that.
and as well as George Washington.
Oh, yes, they were. They, a lot of them were. Absolutely. So,
Can you give us a feeling for like where did your primary sources come from? Like, I'd be interested in just hearing
yeah,
what
well,
were
it's-
in this case that you're discussing,
right.
where did the sources, where do they reside now? Or where'd they come from?
On my bookcase.
Okay, and so how did you get them?
I bought them, but
Okay, well, that's
so
not, yeah,
in
I
my
mean,
research, I want something that talked to me about the stagecoach stops between New York and Boston. And if you go searching, you'll find somebody's got a pamphlet on it. And so, you can get it. So that, and as I say, the libraries are terrific. You get the indexes there on what they have. And a lot of online stuff if you have questions. But then I wanted to get more in-depth stuff. And so, as I say, you got to get the diaries, you got to get the letters. There's a man, James Thatcher, who came from Barnstable, who was a doctor in the war that became a friend of William Eustis. And he had a massive diary. And if you can get a hold of Thatcher's diary, it does day by day. And he makes reference to, I saw so-and-so and we had dinner and I was down there for this. And he traveled with Eustis up from New York to Boston. They'd been 2 years through the war and they had to have a break. So they got permission to take a couple of weeks off. And they stopped in Providence to have, to meet or talk with the governor there. And he gave them coffee. And they loved coffee. It was like a new discovery. So ever after, he keeps talking about how good coffee was.
Like you spoke of some letters that you transcribed. I mean, these are
Yep.
the originals. Where did they come from?
Well, the Mass Historical Society has a bunch of them. And as I say, the New York Historical Society does, and I suspect that a lot of historical societies have them, but we don't know. That's the thing. We have original letters up the road in Falmouth Historical Society, but people aren't going to know that they're there. So we've got to somehow get the historical societies to put the lists out. I mean, Chatham's got a bunch of stuff. Orleans got a bunch of stuff.
Did any of you hear the recent news about,
You have a question.
Dave Robeson.
oh, Dave Rowe? Okay, let me get Dave's question. Hold on. Oh, Dave wants to speak.
I'm unmuted, so I can
Okay,
just shout it
Dave,
out if you don't mind.
Okay, Dave, just a minute. We cannot hear you in the audience.
Oh,
And so can you type your question
it's,
okay,
Hold
just
on.
a minute. If you give me a moment, I think we can do this. So hold on.
While he's doing that.
Yeah.
Question, when you went to the Library of Congress, you weren't able to use camera, copy machine on those materials that you were transcribing? And
Yes, I did on some.
Artists?
I did on some. But it's easier to write down the paragraph. Sometimes,
Then find a
then
machine to do it?
leave your spot and you could copy them. You could copy the microfiche, you could get the copies made.
Okay, Dave, I'm going to turn you on and I'm going to turn this mic off. So just give me about 10 seconds and then you can go.
okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great. But anyway, it's not necessarily a question. It's just that I chose the background today because I knew there was going to be a Revolutionary War element. And actually, she put up a sketch of the Battle of Lexington. And the reason I have this, I took this picture myself when I was out there. One of my Revolutionary War patriot ancestors was was involved in the Battle of Lexington. So that's Buckman's Tavern. For anybody that might be interested, it's right across the street from Lexington Green, or at least it is today. I mean, it was all the green back then. They didn't have cars. They didn't even worry about roads back then. But Buckman's Tavern, and I thought that I would just point it out.
And hopefully Zoom people can hear us again, right?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Okay, my wife has a question. Deb.
I don't know much about the Masonic Lodge, but my great grandfather was part of it. And I have the symbol on my charm bracelet. And I think my mother said something like, if anything that he told her, that if anything ever happened to her, she could show the symbol or whatever, go to the Masonic Lodge and get help. What is there? I'm really interested.